Garen and a dragon named Goose. Chapter 10. The days before the festival passed in a blur. Days Garen spent mostly in his room or by the fire tree trying to connect with Goose. But the river wouldn't come, and Goose was even more frantic than usual and always by Hank's side rather than Garen's. And the people. Every day, his father had to turn away people from the farm, people trying to catch a glimpse of him and Goose, some from Ashbridge or Baytown, others from outside Aria. Even with Darius trying to clear them away, more had come. The only good to come of it was that his father had more people to sell to. All the vegetables and fruits had been growing like crazy, and at least they would have a good store of ambies for the winter. Focus on the now, boy, or focus on others. Whatever it takes to make sure you do not weep again. Garen stirred from his thoughts and looked up at Darius, feeling strangely thankful that he had someone to stand by. Someone that was going to stay with him. But he wasn't going to cry. Not again. They stood at the side of the terraces, looking into Ashbridge Square as the final preparations were made to the festival wagon, the sun shining the last of its pinkish hues from behind Mount Area. Inside the ornate wooden carriage, smaller children pounded a steady beat on drums with thick wooden stick. On the outside, burly men stood at each corner in bright yellow robes, ready to heave the wagon in the right direction, or to shoo small children away from wheels sharp enough to cut rivets into the cobbled ground. Along the thick yellow and blue rope that extended some 20 paces from the front stood mostly small children and their parents, holding onto it as they danced. At the rear, children and adults alike, dressed in the Ashbridge festival attire of yellow and black, played their flutes. Barrels of river wine, placed around the square, were already beginning to run dry, men bending further and further in to scoop out the remnants with long wooden ladles. A stream of people already led out onto the bridge and off into the distance. And it wasn't just people. Usually, it was polite to keep your animal in spirit form and concealed when in public, but today was the exception. Spirit animals were proudly on display, the air full of golden or silver wisps. Most were bird types, as was common in Area, but among them Garen could see a large dog, a pink fox, and even some kind of huge fish that seemed to splash through the air. It was hard to tell what spirit animal belonged to what person. An older man with a long white beard and dressed in brilliant blue robes placed a hand against a spirit plate at the wagon's rear, and with a cheer, the tower of lanterns at the wagon's top, taller than even the inn, lit up one by one, revealing the characters and pictures that changed in a sweeping and pulsing pattern. The square, already bright with lanterns draped along the buildings, became even brighter. It was almost time. Off to one side of the space, families fussed around a group of children who were coming of age, dressed in yellow and white robes. Arden was among them, his mum and dad straightening his brand new robes, or writing the large and blue conned hat atop his head. Arden actually looked nervous for once, his eyes poring over his slate. Being the golden boy of this year's bunch, he had a speech to give, a speech Garen wouldn't hear. It was then that Garen's dad turned and saw Garen staring. He whispered something to Garen's mum, and then walked over to where Garen and Darius stood, away from the bustling crowd. He was wearing his finest robes from many years ago, and the fabric belt at his waist looked as tight as Garen had ever seen it. Still, it didn't fit so badly as Garen's oversized robes handed down from Arden. His dad offered a curt nod to Darius, which was returned with a bow. "Son, how are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Dad, really." His dad placed a hand on shoulder and then pulled Garen in for a tight hug. "I'm so sorry we had to do this, but it's just safer this way. And sure, next year will be different." Garen felt his tears wanting to come, but forced them back. "I know, Dad, it's okay. I've been to the festival so many times before, there's nothing special about this year." Garen's dad pulled away and frowned at that, but only for a moment. "I have to go now." "I love you, son." He looked at Darius, his face becoming like stone. "Look after him, Darius." Darius gave a small bow. "My duty demands no less." With a nod and one last look at Garen, his dad returned to Arden and his mother. With the rest of their group, they began to move to the front of the wagon. Just then, Garen caught sight of Sam, bursting from the inn with Maya and Tom behind him. His robes were even worse fitting than Garen's, so small that the sleeves came to his elbows and the ends to his knees. Not that he seemed to care, his smile as wide as Garen had ever seen it. Tom was dressed impeccably, his expensive and heavily embroidered robes emblazoned with his family's sigil, an eagle of course. and Maya, Garen felt his stomach to turns. She was beautiful as always, dressed like an angel, a flowing white festival dress with yellow flowers that seemed to move with her. But it wasn't those that caught Garen's attention, or the flowers placed cutely in her hair. It was what was in her hand, a single white flower. The three of them came up to Garen, their spirit animals forming around their shoulders from spirit form. As Tanu materialized, he grabbed a loose flap of fabric from Sam's shoulder and hooked it onto his fur, just above his ball. Bamboo yawned on Maya's shoulder, fiddling with a loose strand of Maya's hair as he stared at Tom. Maya herself was looking down, her cheeks flushed red. Tortoise and Tom were both staring so intently at Darius. Garen couldn't tell who was seeing what. As always, it was Sam who spoke first. "Come on, Garen," he said, grabbing Garen's shoulder. "Ditch this guy and let's go. The wagon's about to move." Garen looked to the floor, seeing Goose staring up at him between his legs. The dragon hadn't even tried to bolt for Maya. He seemed to behave himself when Ebba was around. Garen took a deep breath. "I'm not coming, guys. I've been told to stay behind this year. You know, Goose and stuff." Sam froze, his eyes taking on a sheen of tears almost instantly. "You're joking." Garen shook his head. "I'm sorry." The words almost caught in his throat. He looked at Sam, pleading with his eyes not to push him further, or they'd both end up crying. Sam cleared his throat and wiped at his eyes. "Well, we'll get you some of those sweet sticks you love," he said, forcing a laugh. Tom nodded along, still mostly looking at Darius. Maya briefly looked up to look at Garen, and Garen felt a shiver run through him. As quickly as she did, though, her gaze was back to the ground. The wagon began to move, and with one last sad look from Sam, his friends ran off to join it, Maya still clutching the flower in her hand. Still looking at Tom. "Love is for the weak, Garen," Darius said as the crowd followed the wagon. Garen looked up at him. Darius was smirking as he surveyed the crowd, always looking, always searching, and then his eyes opened slightly wider. Ebba turned to gold mist. Garen thought he almost saw a faint shade of pink to the man's cheeks. "No! Better look after my brother properly, Mr. Locke." Zephyr was suddenly right under his nose, her usually messy blonde hair tied neatly in braids, flowers dotted within it. She wore very much the same kind of dress as Maya, a lot more perfume though, his mother's to be exact. Darius looked like every part of him was fighting not to take a step back. Zephyr stood there, right under his nose, her eyes searching through his as she scowled at him. Darius held her gaze for a moment before looking away. She then sighed, and between the wolf sigil on his chest and a seam of silver, she placed a single white flower and straightened one of the many medals on his lapel. Garen blinked. "Take care, brother," she said as she turned to him and gave him a hug. "We'll see you later. I'll bring back some festival food for you." With a quick kiss on the cheek, off she skipped to join the others. Garen watched her go, utterly confused. When she was out of sight, Ebba came back into physical form and sniffed at the flower. Darius cleared his throat. "Tell me, Garen, what does this flower signify?" The soldier was barely daring to look at Garen, his cheeks still obviously a shade of pink. "It's a tradition for girls over 16 to give the boy they like a single flower at the festival. I've never seen Zephyr give one to anyone in the past 2 years," and he couldn't believe what he had seen. Not only had she stared him down, but she'd given him a flower. Zephyr. The shock even pushed away the sadness of seeing Maya obviously getting ready to give one to Tom. Darius still hadn't answered, but Ebba was nuzzling his chest where the flower was. "I suppose I will leave it there for now." Darius looked up into the sky. "I wouldn't want to upset the girl." Garen groaned, and finally Darius looked at him, his eyebrows as sharp as blades. "Be quiet, boy! You have much greater things to worry about!" He did. As the crowd slowly waddled behind the wagon to the beat of drums and flutes, the last rays of sun giving way to the soft glow of lantern light, he could feel it. Something horrible. No one was looking back. Not his friends, nor his parents. It felt as if the air had suddenly chilled. Here he stood, a cold and lonely place, the most famous boy in area or even the world, and the most alone. Something told him that this was only the beginning of it, of his life as an outcast. Ebba nudged into him, and he instinctively reached out to stroke her mane, as he watched the line of lights grow dimmer over the bridge, and then disappear into the growing light of Baytown off in the distance. Ashbridge Square was now empty, only Darius and Garen left. Garen had planned to join some of the younger children on the hill, to look over Baytown for the ending ceremony. but now he just wanted to go home, to hide away again, to give up. Just then came a sound, a squeaking of a cartwheel, and slowly, from the road down to Kern Bay, came a merchant's cart, fish swinging from its hooks. Dak, but something wasn't right. As Dak came into view, he seemed to be struggling against the weight of the cart, and then he slipped. Garen ran over to help. Dak, he had fallen to the ground just as the cart had reached level footing and was covered in sweat. Garen and a dragon named Goose, Chapter 10, Part 2. Garen put a hand to his wide forehead. "He's burning up," he said to Darius as the man calmly walked up. The mage looked over the boy, as spiritless, he said, his mouth moving as if the word tasted bad. Garen shot him a glare. "A friend." Dak opened his eyes. "Garen, I have to get to the festival. Need to sell fish." His voice was barely a whimper, and his eyes didn't seem to be focusing until he saw Ebba looming near. Then he looked scared. "Garen, help me up." As heavy as he was, it took both Garen and Darius to lift him, but he could barely stand. "I don't think it's a good idea for you to go to Baytown like this, Dak. We need to get you home." Dak looked off into the distance over the bridge, towards the lights of Baytown. Then he sighed, a rasping sound, and nodded. "But how can we get my cart back down?" Darius stepped forward, attempting to lift the tongue of the cart. "How in the mother's name do you lift this boy?" Not waiting for an answer, he put his hand against the cart. An array of blue lines lit up along his sleeve as his other hand turned in the air. With a soft hum, the cart lifted from the ground, and Darius took hold of the wooden tongue. "I'll deal with the cart," Garen gulped. It was the single most advanced bit of magic he had ever seen. Magitech circuitry in the sleeve, intricate patterns with his hand that no doubt controlled his spirit energy. Perhaps even mana was involved. It was mind-boggling. Dak's full weight almost made Garen topple as he stared open, mouthed at Darius, and he turned his attention to the large boy. Slowly, they began to walk down the steep path. Dak kept a watchful eye on Ebba but didn't comment on it. Goose followed alongside the wolf, like a small shadow. "What happened, Dak?" Garen asked after the first few heavy steps. "I thought you and Sam might be feeling it too," Dak said, taking his time between breaths. "That batch of fish from the night I saw you. Been feeling ill ever since. I'm so sorry." Garen looked at Dak, seeing the burly teen not wanting to look him in the eye. "Dak, what are you talking about? It was delicious. Sam and I have been fine." Dak's sad face then turned to a smile as he met Garen's eye. "That's good to know, Garen. I was so worried." They continued hobbling down the hill, a sheer cliff of white stone growing taller on one side and the bank of the river snaking along on the right. Overhead loomed a bridge, bordered by moonlight and stars. Ahead, the sea sparkled, but Garen couldn't see any sign of the bay. In all of his years living nearby, he'd never once been down here. Hardly anyone came, especially the military. "Dak, where is it?" Garen asked, trying not to sound stupid. Dak pointed up ahead, breathing heavily. "In the cliff on the left is an archway. It leads through to the bay." Just a few strides further, and they found themselves beneath a natural archway carved through the cliff's rugged face. Atop the arch was a large worn sign reading Kern Bay in sprawled and rough white painted letters. They stepped through cobbled sand, giving way to wooden slats, decks, and rails. The cart's wheels thudded heavily back on the wood as Darius disengaged his spell and hefted the wooden tongue himself. "Welcome to Kern Bay," Dak breathed, a hint of pride in his voice. Above and around them, Kern Bay came into full view, a chaotic and sprawling labyrinth of wood. Buildings and rooms, cobbled together from a mismatched assortment of reclaimed or cut timber, clung precariously to the cliffside, perched atop rickety stilts embedded deep in the sandy shore below. Some were small, humble shacks, others larger buildings of 3 to 4 stories tall. All bore the scars of weather, or smears of white lined their edges, gifted from the salty sea breeze. Here and there, weathered fabrics served as makeshift awnings, providing a semblance of shelter and a patchwork of colors. Along the sprawling decks that ran between and through the buildings, burning lamps offered their light, flames dancing in the wind. From 3 places below, down the wooden steps or tracks, docks lead out into the sea, small fishing boats and other strange-looking vessels lining them, sails furled and lines moored. "I never knew it was this big," Garen said, taking it all in. Dak gave a weak smile, his breathing labored. "More spiritless than you thought." Garen nodded, and they trudged on, Dak pointing the way. down through the labyrinth they went, barely another soul to be seen, although Garen could hear some through the thin wooden walls. The deck creaked under the weight of the cart. Most have gone to Baytown, Dak offered, when seeing Garen peeking around corners or through windows. Eventually, they came to a small shack, tucked away at the end of the lower deck as it went under the lower deck, as it went under the one above and trailed off into sand. Set between two heavy supporting pillars of wood that held the upper level, it barely seemed to be more than a frayed red awning covering a hole. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the lone window was so grimy and dark you couldn't see inside. Even the tide, now high, was only 20 paces away. Darius took the rope tied to the side of the cart and looped it over a rusted hook by the shack. Dak pointed to the awning, his hands shaking as much as his voice. "Home sweet ho!" Garen couldn't stop Dak tumbling to the deck as he suddenly fell. Dak was completely out of it, mumbling to himself and burning up worse by the second. Dak! A short old man had appeared in the doorway of the shack, not a hair on his head, but a large grey bread tumbling from his jaw and over his grey, dirty overalls. Garen could only see a single tooth in the man's mouth. Dak, despite his obvious age, he hobbled quickly over, a short wooden cane prodding against the sand and wood. Slowly, he bent down, smelling of fish in the sea, and placed a hand on the boy's head. He glanced at Darius and Ebba, not seeing Goose hidden behind her. "What happened, boy?" he said, finally turning to Garen. He collapsed on the road to Ashbridge, and we helped him back down. He said he had some bad fish. Garen stretched out his hand. "I'm Garen. This is Darius." The old man narrowed his eyes at Garen's hand and flicked his gaze to Darius again. "Sorry if I'm not entirely believing of fellas like yourselves helping the spiritless. Goose suddenly came over and curled up on Dak's chest." The old man looked long and hard at the dragon. Goose stared back. "You're that boy, aren't you?" he said, his eyes not leaving Goose. "The dragon boy." "Yes," Garen said, "and you must be Dak's grandfather." The old man simply nodded as he got back up and went into the shack. He returned a few moments later with a wet, brown cloth and a small jar of green liquid, stopped with a cork. He shook the small bottle of liquid as he squatted down again. "This will break the fever." Carefully, he tapped a few drops onto Dak's lips and laid the wet cloth over his forehead. Goose watched on with interest, never moving from Dak's chest. "Dak said you made the chain for him, for his spirit stone," Garen said, eyeing the chain. "Aye, that I did," he said as he moved to sit cross-legged next to Dak. "You know, living a life like this." Suddenly, Ebba was sniffing at Goose, and Darius quickly moved in beside her, his brow furrowed. "Garen, how old is this boy?" 19, Garen said, exchanging a puzzled look with the old man. "This can't be possible," Darius said, fingers rubbing his chin. Garen followed Darius's gaze to Goose, and it was then he finally noticed a green and pulsating glow emanating from beneath the dragon. Scooping Goose out of the way, he felt his breath escape him. Dak's spirit stone was pulsing with green light as if a weak heartbeat. "A spirit approaches," Darius whispered. Garen could hardly believe it. "A spirit? That's fantastic." Darius shook his head. "If this boy doesn't summon his spirit successfully," he looked at the old man, a grave look on his face, "he will die." Garen froze. "What? But surely he can summon it. How little you know, Garen," Darius said, pity in his eyes as he looked at Dak. Headmasters in the schools are skilled practitioners in summonings, and usually prepare the ceremonies weeks in advance, conjuring the spirit in advance, conjuring the spirit into a full and safe manifestation. He bent down, taking the stone in hand. "For one that has laid dormant for so long, the process is far more complex. Never have I heard of someone 19 years of age obtaining a spirit, although it is said to be possible," he sighed, putting the stone back on the boy's chest. "But I have heard of those younger that perished in doing so." The old man's frail hand shot out and held Darius's. "Please, sir, help my grandson. He's all I have left. I beg you." Darius shook his hand away. "It is not my place, old man, nor my duty. Even if I were obliged to help, summonings are something I know very little about." He stood back up, looking over to the bright lights of Baytown docks in the distance. "Anyone who could have helped would never reach us in time." "Darius, please!" Garen begged, watching as the old man cried and cradled Dak's head in his hands. "Just try! I know you can do it!" "And what?" Darius roared. deplete my energy in doing so, and then have someone swoop in and take you, or worse, kill you. He stepped closer to Garen, pointing a finger in his face. I will never fail my duty, Garen. Never. The finger turned into a fist, and for a moment, Garen thought Darius was going to punch him. Then he lowered it and took a deep breath. There is only one person who can help him now. Garen's hopes rose. Who? You, Garen. You!